So today we're working on rebuilding a transmission, and I thought I would take some time and take some of the footage from that where we were doing some gear counting and doing calculations. And I think that might be very helpful to some people out there who are trying to build hybrid transmissions and trying to understand, well, what gear ratios would be helpful and of the like. So follow along. There's some math that I hope that this helps somebody. Alright, so now that we've got this transmission set pulled out, what I want to do is I want to start measuring the number of gears on each of these. So one of the concerns we have is we want to make sure that the gear set that is in this transmission is going to be adequate for the vehicle. So we establish that by doing some math. So what we do is we need to count gears, and then I'll show you the formula for how we determine the gear ratio on the transmission. Okay, so now I've counted all the gears. Now it's time for me to go ahead and calculate the gear ratio. So what we want to do is we're going to do some math. They told you guys that you don't use math when you're... Yeah, we use it all the time. So here up above are our gear counts. This is our input gear, this is our countershaft gear, so power flows in through here, and then through one of these sets out to the main shaft. So now, what we do is, like for first gear, for example, 21, 32, and then 14 and 33. So what we do is we put 32 over 21, 33 over 14, we multiply both top and both the numerators and the denominators together. It ends up with 1056 over 294, which ends up 3.592. Our ratio is 3.592 to 1. The other thing I have is the handbook, the actual service manual, and if you look, if we have a drive gear of 21, a counter gear of 32, and then a main shaft gear of 33, and a counter shaft gear of 14, our first gear ratio is 3.592 to 1. So now that we know that that's a 3.592 first gear, it gives us an idea that this is a wide ratio transmission. But let's go through and do the math and see what all of our gear ratios are. That'll help us to understand kind of a placement of where this transmission came from, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so after doing all the math, calculating this out, these are our gear ratios. So it's a 3.592 first gear, a 2.245 second gear, a 1.415 third gear, a 1:1 fourth gear, because as you know, input and output are equivalent, and then fifth gear is 0.0882 to 1. Now, in a sport truck, that's probably not the best gear ratio set to have, partly because overdrive sucks, and then first gear is really, really low. So to counter that, I know that Carl has a taller differential in the rear end of his truck, so I think that's actually kind of how he's crutching that. But I would usually recommend changing our input gear ratios to get a different gear set. But I'm not sure I have anything to make that happen. Alright, so I know that this is Carl's other transmission. It's an older transmission. I'm not sure we're gaining anything here, but I think I want to pop this thing apart, find out what the ratios are inside of it, and then establish if this set of gears would help us in some way. Okay, so this transmission right here, and then this is the case for the transmission that we're working on right now. This is a nice little spotting guide, I guess. So we can tell that this is an early pre-1980 transmission, and that one is a post-1980 transmission. We can tell that by the ribbing on the case of the back, the extension housing case. This case is this case section physically is going to look different and going to have these ribs on it on a pre-1980 case. Now this guy right here has no such ribbing. It's a lot more smooth. So this right here tells us that this case right here is a post-1980 case. So that's a 1980 and later. This is a 1979 and earlier. The flaw here is that the case 1980 and later cases look all, have this design to them. Unfortunately, most people end up thinking that if it's got an L-series bell housing on it, that it's got to be somehow a close ratio transmission from a 280ZX, and that's not the case. Because the 1980 720 still had an L20B, and the other vehicle would have been the 80 and 81 280ZX, which did not have a close ratio trans, and then also the Maxima. So you have a bunch of different transmissions that will look visibly the same, but you may not have a close ratio transmission. So the only way you'll actually know is doing the math we did earlier to establish what the transmission is. So let's go ahead and get this transmission taken out of its case. We're not going to actually fully disassemble this transmission, but we're going to get it out of the case, and we're going to identify what this gear set is, whether most of the early transmissions are all very, very similar gear ratios, but if it is like a Z 5-speed, which it could be, it would give us a better first, second, third. Alright, so here we have the transmission that we pulled out of that case. Now this, again, bear in mind, this is a pre-1980 transmission. So this has a couple of things that are different, and you'll find indicative of a pre-1980 71 series 5-speed. The most important key detail is this guy right here. So this synchronizer hub right here is no longer available. That's a Porsche style synchro. The rest of these are brass. That's the key indicator. Now if we were taking this apart any further, first thing we would do is we would remove these 3 bolts, remove the springs and check valves. We would use a pin punch and punch out the punch pins on these 3 shift rods. We would extract these rods, removing the ball bearings that go, the check balls that go in between here and here, and then with the shift forks out, we would then remove the main shaft nut, which you can see this is loose. This is a common problem. The counter shaft nut, we would remove as much of this mechanism as we could, along with these pieces right here. So this is the speedometer drive gear. This is your rear main shaft bearing. So these would come out. Then we would get to that point where we were on the press, where we're pressing this out. And then as it does that, it draws out the counter shaft at the same time. Okay, so I've done the math on this second transmission, and here's what we found. So this transmission right here, this is what we're looking at. These ratios in purple right here. So you look at first gear, the transmission that Carl brought us versus this other one. This is a 3.21 to 1 ratio first, so it's taller than this first over here. And then of course a little better spacing on second, third. So third to fourth is a little bit tighter, as well as second to first and first to second. The overdrives are virtually identical, 0.882 and then 0.864. So ultimately, what can we do? Well, if we change the input gears, here, if you take a look at the numerical data, so here's the input gears for the transmission that we got brought by Carl, the one that was in his truck, and then this is first, so this is first, second, and third, and if you go down here, first, second, and third, and if you look, those numbers are identical. So if you look at what the difference really is, first through fourth, the difference is these input gears. So if you change the input gears, you immediately change these ratios to this. So if you're trying to go to a closer ratio, then the easy thing to do is change input gears. But that also affects our overdrive. So now, if I have this 0.882 overdrive and I use these input gears, what does it end up being? Well, or these input gears with this overdrive, what does it end up being? Well, there's the math right there, and it's a 0.815 overdrive. For me, 0.815 doesn't make a whole big of a difference, especially since the customer's used to driving this truck around with these much lower gears. And so he has, in essence, if I change that all around, he doesn't really gain anything, arguably. Maybe a slightly taller overdrive, but the data, the numbers aren't going to change a whole lot for him. His cruising RPM is not going to change a whole lot. So we're going to rebuild this transmission that he brought us. We're going to rebuild that transmission as built. But the nice thing, like I say, is that when you have the data up here, then you can start identifying what this transmission is. You can start manipulating, well, this gear set in this transmission would offer me better things. So once you know the ratios, it can help you match the transmission gearing to the drivetrain. So let's go ahead and start cleaning parts up and start getting this thing to assembly. So as you saw, there's a lot going on there. There are various different gear ratios available, and there's quite a bit that you can play with if you have the parts to do it. So just know that you have options. In a lot of cases, most of your modern C versions of that transmission will have much better overdrives. Like with the close ratio option, there is a particular gear set that gives you a 0.759 to 1 overdrive, which is excellent. That same gear combo with the wide ratio combo works really well with four-wheel drives, and it's a 0.821 overdrive. So again, lots and lots of options out there. So it's just a matter of playing around, get your head around it. If you've got lots of parts and lots of broken transmissions, sometimes it's just a matter of pulling stuff apart and seeing what you have. So again, hopefully this math was helpful. Hopefully it proved that math is still useful even if you are out of high school. And I'll catch you another time.